Who would have thought that the quiet widow with the calloused hands and gentle smile could bring a ruthless gang of criminals to their knees? What they didn't realize was that beneath her unassuming appearance lay the brilliant mind of a former military engineer whose defensive systems were once commissioned by elite special forces across 3 continents. They made their biggest mistake when they torched her barn, not knowing every inch of her property was connected by an intricate network of pressure plates, sensors, and mechanical traps that could turn the entire estate into a fortress at the flip of a switch. By the time they realized who they were dealing with, it was already too late. The traps had quite literally sprung. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning light filtered through the old oak trees of Redwood Valley, casting dappled shadows across Eleanor Ellie Blackwood's sprawling homestead. At 47, Ellie moved with the deliberate precision of someone who calculated every action. Her auburn hair, streaked with silver, pulled back in a practical ponytail that swung gently as she made her way across the yard toward the barn that stood as the working heart of her property. The imposing structure dominated the landscape with its weathered red boards and sturdy frame, a monument to generations of Blackwood craftsmanship. Unlike the simpler barns that dotted neighboring properties, Ellie's was a marvel of subtle engineering, reinforced joints, specialized storage areas, and a foundation so solid that locals joked it could withstand a tornado. The sight of it always brought a wistful smile to her face, a reminder of Daniel, her late husband, and the life they had built together. "Morning, old friend," she murmured to the barn, running her hand along the worn wooden door. "Let's see what today brings." Ellie pulled a peculiar-looking keyring from her pocket, selected an unusual brass key, and unlocked a panel nearly invisible in the barn's eastern wall. Inside was a series of gauges, switches, and a small digital display. Technology that seemed oddly sophisticated for a rural homestead. She checked readings, made minor adjustments, and noted the results in a small leather-bound journal she always carried. Most folks in Millerville, the nearest town, believed Ellie was simply a widow struggling to maintain her late husband's property. They pitied her, this woman alone on 200 acres, with nothing but livestock and occasional hired help for company. What they didn't know, what almost no one knew, was that Eleanor Blackwood had been Eleanor Reeves, one of the most innovative security systems engineers the U.S. military had ever employed. Before marrying Daniel and settling in Redwood Valley, Ellie had designed perimeter security for military installations from Afghanistan to South Korea. Her integrated defensive systems had protected embassies, forward operating bases, and classified research facilities. The network of sensors, alarms, and mechanical responses that ran throughout her property was her masterpiece, a project she and Daniel had worked on together until his passing 4 years ago. "Morning, Mrs. Blackwood," called a cheerful voice, pulling Ellie from her thoughts. Turning, she spotted young Max Cooper, the 17-year-old son of her closest neighbors, riding up on his chestnut quarter-horse. Max helped part-time around the homestead, handling chores, too demanding for Ellie to manage alone. "Morning, Max," she replied, quickly closing and securing the hidden panel before standing. "You're early today." Max dismounted, his freckled face bright with excitement. "Dad said the Rawlins gang was spotted near Miller's Crossing last night. Thought you might want some extra help keeping an eye on things." Ellie nodded, brushing dust from her work pants. The Rawlins gang had been terrorizing properties throughout the county for months, burning barns, stealing livestock, and intimidating families into selling their land at fractions of its worth. Developers were paying premium prices for properties in Redwood Valley, and the gang had found profit in forcing sales through fear. "That's thoughtful of you both. I was just about to check the north fence line. You can ride with me." As they walked toward the stable, Ellie pointed out tasks for the day and asked about Max's schooling. Their conversation was easy, comfortable, the kind that developed from years of shared work and mutual respect. Inside the stable, Ellie saddled her mare, a steady buckskin named Penny, while Max prepared his own horse. The morning routine was comforting in its predictability. Check the barn systems, tend to the animals, inspect the perimeter sensors, and review the day's work with whoever was helping out. Since Daniel's death, these rhythms had kept her grounded, given structure to days that might otherwise have been swallowed by grief. "So how are things in town?" Ellie asked as they rode out, following a path that wound through stands of maple trees toward the northern boundary of her property. Max shrugged, tense. "Sheriff Thompson's stretched thin with the Rawlins gang causing trouble, and there's talk about some fancy real estate developer making offers all over the county." Ellie's expression remained neutral, but something in her posture shifted, almost imperceptibly. "A developer, you say? Did you hear which company?" "Horizon Estates, I think. Mr. Jenkins at the hardware store said they've been buying up properties all around Redwood Valley. Planning some kind of luxury retreat or something." Ellie nodded, filing the information away. Land developers often used intimidation tactics when legal channels proved too slow or expensive. The connection between the Rawlins gang's activities and this Horizon Estates wasn't difficult to make. As they created a small rise, Ellie's eyes scanned the tree line with practiced precision. To anyone else, it would appear she was simply enjoying the view, but Max had worked with her long enough to recognize when she was checking her property's defenses. "Mrs. Blackwood," Max began hesitantly, "Dad was wondering if you'd consider selling. Not that he wants you to," he added quickly. "Just with the Rawlins gang around and you being here alone so much." Ellie smiled gently. "Your father's concern is appreciated, Max. But this land isn't just property to me. It's Daniel's legacy, our legacy." She paused, her gaze drifting toward a seemingly ordinary fence post that contained one of her more sophisticated motion sensors. "And I'm not as defenseless as people might think." Max nodded, though Ellie could tell he didn't fully understand. How could he? Few people knew that beneath the peaceful surface of Blackwood Homestead lay defensive capabilities that would impress military commanders. They continued their ride, checking fence lines and property markers, while Ellie mentally catalogued the status of her hidden security measures. Each tree line, each ridge, each seemingly random rock formation had been carefully integrated into her defensive network, natural camouflage for a system designed to protect more than just property. As they approached the eastern boundary, Ellie noticed unusual tracks crossing her land, multiple horses moving with purpose rather than the random patterns of wild animals. Someone had been scouting her property, studying its layout. "Looks like we've had visitors," she said quietly, dismounting to examine the tracks more closely. Max looked alarmed. "The Rawlins gang?" "Possibly." Ellie's voice was calm, but her mind was already calculating adjustments to her security protocols. "Let's finish our rounds and head back. I think tonight might be eventful." The sun climbed higher as they completed their inspection, casting shorter shadows across the valley. To casual observers, Eleanor Blackwood was simply a widow tending her late husband's homestead. But as she guided Penny back toward the barn, her thoughts were those of Eleanor Reeves, security specialist, anticipating threats, planning countermeasures, preparing for a confrontation that now seemed inevitable. The widow of Redwood Valley was being targeted, but unlike other victims of the Rawlins gang, she was far from helpless. The trap was set, but not in the way her would-be attackers imagined. Back at the barn, Ellie's practiced hands moved swiftly as she unpacked her saddlebags and retrieved her journal. Max had departed reluctantly, promising to return the next morning with his father's shotgun, a gesture Ellie appreciated but knew wouldn't be necessary. Her security went far beyond conventional firearms. Once alone, she entered a sequence on the hidden keypad beside her workbench. A section of the barn's floor slid open, revealing a steep staircase descending into darkness. Motion-activated lights flickered on as she made her way down, illuminating a command center that would have impressed her former military colleagues. 3 walls displayed monitors showing various angles of her property: fence lines, approaches, the main house, and outbuildings. The 4th wall held an array of equipment: communications devices, weapons in locked cabinets, and a detailed 3-dimensional model of the entire homestead. This underground hub, built during the Cold War as a fallout shelter by Daniel's grandfather, had been repurposed into the nerve center of Ellie's security system. She moved to the central console and began adjusting settings, increasing sensitivity on the perimeter sensors and checking the status of various defensive measures. The tracks they'd discovered weren't the only warning sign. Small disruptions in her security network over the past week had initially seemed like animal interference, but the pattern now suggested methodical reconnaissance. "They're mapping the property," she murmured to herself, studying the data logs, testing for weaknesses. Ellie pulled up archived footage, confirming her suspicions. Shadowy figures had been probing her outer defenses, always retreating before triggering any major alarms. Professional work, not random trespassing. She recognized the methodology: start at the edges, identify security measures, look for blind spots, then strike where least expected. A soft chime from one of the monitors drew her attention. A vehicle had stopped on the county road, bordering her western property line. Ellie zoomed in to see a black SUV with tinted windows. 2 men emerged, one tall and lean with a distinctive scar across his jawline, the other shorter but powerfully built, with the watchful stance of someone accustomed to violence. The taller man surveyed her property through binoculars, while his companion consulted what appeared to be a map. They spoke briefly before returning to their vehicle and driving away. Ellie captured still images of both men and ran them through a facial recognition program linked to law enforcement databases, a connection maintained by former colleagues who owed her favors. As she waited for results, she climbed back to the barn and headed toward the main house, a 2-story farmhouse that had stood for over a century. Like the barn, it appeared ordinary from the outside: weathered white clapboard with green shutters, a wraparound porch with a swing, flowering bushes along the foundation. But beneath its conventional exterior, the house contained surprises that would confound even experienced intruders. Inside, Ellie moved through the kitchen to her study, where a wall of family photos concealed a hidden safe. She entered a combination and retrieved a sealed envelope containing documents and a satellite phone. Insurance, in case things escalated beyond what local authorities could handle. Her laptop chimed with an incoming message. The facial recognition search had yielded results. Victor Rawlins, leader of the notorious gang terrorizing the county, and his lieutenant, Marcus Denton. Both had extensive criminal records, including arson, extortion, and suspected contract killing. The report confirmed what she had already suspected. These weren't random criminals. They were professionals hired to clear obstacles for development. A quick search for Horizon Estates revealed a corporate structure with multiple shell companies, ultimately leading back to Westland Development Group, a firm with a history of acquiring land through questionable means. Their usual pattern was consistent: buy some properties legally, pressure holdouts through increasingly aggressive tactics, then develop once the entire area was secured. Ellie was preparing dinner when her security system signaled another approach. This time, the visitor came openly. Sheriff Jim Thompson's patrol car pulling up her driveway. She disarmed the entry sensors and stepped onto the porch as he parked. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Evening, Ellie," Thompson called, tipping his hat as he approached. At 55, the sheriff carried himself with the weary dignity of a man who'd spent decades in law enforcement. He'd been Daniel's friend, and his concern for Ellie since her husband's death had been genuine, if sometimes misplaced. "Sheriff," she nodded, "coffee's fresh if you've got time." "Always got time for your coffee," he smiled, following her inside. At the kitchen table, Thompson's expression grew serious. "Had some trouble over at Miller Place last night. Their barn burned to the ground. Family barely got out with the livestock." Ellie poured coffee into 2 mugs. "The Rawlins gang. Looks that way. 3rd barn fire in 2 months. All properties that refused offers from that new development company." Thompson stirred sugar into his coffee. "I've requested help from the state police, but they're stretched thin. Until reinforcements arrive, I'm checking on folks who might be targets." "Like widows living alone on valuable property," Ellie observed. Thompson nodded grimly. "Exactly. The Millers signed sale papers this morning for half what their land's worth. Fear's a powerful motivator." He studied her face. "I'd feel better if you stayed in town for a while, Ellie. The Harrises have a spare room. They'd be happy to offer." "I appreciate the concern, Jim, but I'm not leaving my home." The sheriff sighed, clearly having anticipated her refusal. "At least let me assign a deputy to patrol your property." Ellie shook her head. "Your deputies have enough to do. Besides, I've got good security. Daniel made sure of that." Thompson looked skeptical. "Security systems don't stop determined men. With gasoline and matches, Ellie." She smiled slightly. "Mine might surprise you." After the sheriff departed with reluctant acceptance of her decision, Ellie returned to the basement command center. The encounter with Thompson confirmed her timeline. The Rawlins gang was escalating their tactics, moving from intimidation to destruction. If they followed their established pattern, her property would be targeted within days. She initiated a full security diagnostic, checking each component of her defensive network. The system had 3 graduated response levels: detection, deterrence, and neutralization. Until now, she'd kept it set to detection only, monitoring rather than responding to intrusions. Tonight, she activated the deterrence protocols for the outer perimeter. The barn required special attention. If the gang followed their pattern, it would be their primary target, both symbolically important and practically devastating to a working homestead. Ellie spent an hour reinforcing its defenses, adding elements that would specifically counter arson attempts. As darkness fell, she completed a final check of all systems before returning to the house. From a concealed panel in the hallway, she activated the nighttime security configuration. Subtle changes rippled across the property. Motion sensors adjusted their sensitivity. Pressure plates beneath key approach paths armed themselves, and cameras switched to infrared mode. In her bedroom, Ellie opened the drawer of her nightstand and removed Daniel's service pistol, checking it methodically before returning it. She hoped she wouldn't need conventional weapons, but experience had taught her to prepare for all contingencies. Sleep came in measured intervals that night. 20 minutes awake, monitoring security feeds, 40 minutes of light sleep. Repeat. A soldier's rest pattern, one she hadn't needed to employ since leaving government service. Just after 2 a.m., a proximity alert from the eastern perimeter broke her sleep cycle. Ellie moved quickly to the monitoring station she'd installed in her closet, bypassing the need to reach the barn's command center. The night vision cameras showed 3 figures moving through the tree line, maintaining cover while advancing toward the main buildings. Their approach was tactical, spaced apart, using natural cover, minimizing exposure. Not the behavior of common criminals. These men had military or law enforcement training, confirming her suspicions about Rawlins hiring professionals for their more demanding jobs. Ellie watched as they paused at the edge of the clearing, studying the house and barn. The leader, she, recognized Denton's powerful build, signaled for the others to circle toward the barn while he maintained watch on the main house. They carried backpacks that likely contained accelerants and incendiary devices. Just as expected, Ellie whispered to herself, feeling a strange calm settle over her. The moment of transition had arrived, from Widow Blackwood to Eleanor Reeves, security specialist. She had hoped Redwood Valley would remain her refuge, a place where that part of her life could stay buried. But now, as threats converged on her home, she embraced the skills and mindset that had once made her reputation. Her fingers moved across the control panel, activating specific defensive measures while leaving others dormant. The trap was set, calibrated not just to protect her property, but to send a message that would resonate throughout the county. The widow's homestead was not the vulnerable target they imagined. As the intruders approached the barn, Ellie allowed herself a grim smile. "Welcome to Blackwood Homestead, gentlemen. You're about to have a very educational evening." Ellie's fingers danced across the control panel with practiced precision, activating a sequence that she'd hoped would never be necessary. On her monitor, the three intruders approached the barn from different angles, their thermal signatures bright against the cool night landscape. They moved with the confidence of men who believed their target was sleeping peacefully, unaware of their presence. "Execute Security Protocol Delta," she murmured, a verbal command that activated the system's voice recognition feature. The computer acknowledged with a soft chime as secondary systems came online. What happened next would have astonished anyone familiar with Eleanor Blackwood, widow and hobby farmer. But it would have been entirely unsurprising to those who had worked with Eleanor Reeves, the woman whose defensive designs had revolutionized perimeter security for high-value targets worldwide. The first intruder reached the barn's side door, testing it cautiously before producing a set of lockpicks. As he manipulated the seemingly simple lock, a silent alert triggered on Ellie's monitor. She watched, expression cool and detached, as the man finally breached the door and slipped. Inside the barn, his companions maintained their positions, one covering the approach to the house, the other moving toward the back of the barn with what appeared to be a gasoline canister. 15 years earlier, in a classified facility deep beneath the Nevada desert, Captain Eleanor Reeves had stood before a panel of military and intelligence officials. Behind her, a projection displayed schematics for an integrated defensive system unlike anything previously developed. "The fundamental flaw in conventional security," she had explained, "is its predictability. Fences, guards, cameras, targets can identify and circumvent them. My system creates an environment where the entire perimeter becomes an active defensive grid, capable of adapting to intrusion methods in real time." The memory surfaced as Ellie watched the intruder inside her barn, moving toward the center, unaware that he had already triggered 3 separate detection mechanisms. None had alerted him with noise or light. This phase was purely for monitoring, gathering data on his movements and intentions. Back then, she had been a rising star in military engineering. After graduating top of her class from MIT with dual degrees in mechanical engineering and computer science, Eleanor had been recruited directly into a classified defense program. Her specialized focus became non-lethal defensive systems, technologies that could incapacitate threats without causing permanent harm. "Target 1 has breached primary structure," the security system announced quietly. "Accelerant detected." The monitor, Ellie could see the thermal signature of the gasoline container the man was now uncapping. He began splashing the liquid around the barn's interior, concentrating on the wooden support beams. "Containment protocol authorized," Ellie commanded. In her previous life, Eleanor had designed systems for embassies, military installations, and government black sites. Her innovations had saved countless lives during a terrorist attack on an American consulate in 2008, an incident so classified that her role remained redacted from all public records. The technologies she pioneered had been adapted for presidential security details and nuclear facilities. But everything changed when she met Daniel Blackwood during a security conference in Washington. A former Army Ranger turned structural engineer, Daniel had challenged her assumptions about perimeter defense during a panel discussion. Their intellectual sparring had evolved into dinner, then dating, and eventually a partnership that transcended professional collaboration. On her screen, the man inside the barn had finished distributing gasoline and reached for something in his pocket, likely a lighter or matches. Ellie pressed a sequence on her console, and the barn's interior lighting suddenly activated, momentarily, blinding the intruder. "What the—" His startled voice came through the barn's concealed microphones. Before he could recover, a series of mechanical clicks echoed through the structure as previously hidden panels in the floor and walls opened. From these compartments rose a network of thin pipes, forming a grid throughout the barn. The intruder spun around, trying to make sense of what was happening. Daniel had understood her work in ways no one else had. When they married and she left government service, it was his idea to integrate her security innovations into their new home. "We'll build something together," he'd said, "something that protects what matters most." They had spent years refining the systems, turning Blackwood Homestead into what Daniel jokingly called the world's most secure farm. The intruder in the barn was now backing toward the door, suddenly aware that he had walked into something unexpected. But as he reached for the handle, a fine mist began spraying from the pipe network, a specially formulated compound Ellie had developed during her government work. "Non-toxic neutralizing agent deployed," the system reported. Accelerant being rendered inert, the chemical reaction was immediate, transforming the flammable gasoline into a harmless, foul-smelling gel. Simultaneously, a secondary spray coated the intruder's clothing and skin with a distinct ultraviolet reactive dye, invisible to the naked eye but unmistakable under certain light conditions. Evidence that would be impossible to wash away. For at least a week. Outside, the second intruder had reached the barn's rear entrance with his own gasoline container. As he prepared to enter, pressure plates beneath his feet triggered a different response. The ground around him suddenly transformed, as concealed sprinklers activated, not with water, but with a slippery polymer compound that spread rapidly across the soil. The man lost his footing immediately, crashing down hard and spilling his gasoline container. As he struggled to stand, the polymer continued spreading, creating an ever-expanding slick that made traction impossible. Each attempt to rise resulted in another fall, like a cruel slapstick routine. After Daniel's death in a car accident 4 years ago, Ellie had considered disabling the elaborate security systems. They were painful reminders of their shared passion, their late-night design sessions, the technical challenges they'd overcome together. But something had stopped her, perhaps intuition, perhaps simply the security professional's ingrained caution. Instead, she had maintained the systems meticulously, even enhancing them with updates based on technologies that had since been declassified. The Blackwood Homestead's defenses now represented the pinnacle of Eleanor Reeves's expertise, combined with Daniel Blackwood's structural ingenuity. The third intruder, observing his companion's difficulties, abandoned his surveillance position and rushed toward the barn. Ellie tracked his movement, adjusting the response protocols accordingly. As he crossed the midpoint of the yard, motion sensors triggered a different defensive measure. From concealed ports along the barn's exterior, powerful LED arrays suddenly activated, bathing the area in disorienting patterns of light. The strobing effect, precisely calibrated to create temporary sensory confusion without triggering seizures, stopped the man in his tracks. The neurological impact was similar to severe motion sickness, not harmful, but immediately debilitating. Intruder 3 neutralized. The system confirmed as the man dropped to his knees, overwhelming disorientation making further progress impossible. Inside the barn, the first intruder was frantically trying the door, only to find it had automatically locked behind him. His radio crackled with the panicked voices of his companions, adding to his growing alarm. "What the hell is happening?" he demanded into his radio. "Denton, come in!" Ellie activated the barn's internal communication system. "Your associates are currently indisposed." Her voice emerged from hidden speakers, electronically distorted to prevent identification. "As are you." The man spun wildly, searching for the source of the voice. "Who's there? Show yourself." "That won't be necessary," Ellie replied calmly. "Your attempted arson has been documented and reported. The chemical compound now covering your clothing contains unique identifiers linked specifically to the accelerant you brought onto my property." She allowed herself a small smile as she watched the realization dawn on the intruder's face. He wasn't dealing with a helpless widow. He had walked into a trap designed by one of the most sophisticated security minds of her generation. "You have two options," Ellie continued. "You can await the sheriff's arrival, or you can leave immediately and deliver a message to Victor Rawlins." The man's shock at hearing his boss's name was evident even through the security monitor. "What message?" he asked, voice suddenly uncertain. Ellie's response was measured, each word deliberate. "Tell him that Blackwood Homestead is not for sale. Not now, not ever. And inform him that his next attempt will trigger countermeasures significantly less comfortable than what you've experienced tonight." With precise keystrokes, Ellie unlocked the barn door. "You have 30 seconds to decide." The intruder needed less than 5, bolting through the door and staggering toward his companions. Together, the three men retreated in disarray, abandoning equipment in their haste to escape the property that had so thoroughly outmatched them. Ellie watched until their thermal signatures disappeared beyond her perimeter sensors. Then she leaned back in her chair, feeling the weight of the past pressing against her shoulders. Eleanor Reeves had resurfaced tonight after years of dormancy. The question now was how far she would need to go to protect what she and Daniel had built. "Security Protocol Delta complete," the system announced, returning to standard monitoring status. "No," Ellie countermanded. "Maintain an elevated alert. This was only the beginning." Dawn broke over Blackwood Homestead with streaks of crimson and gold painting the eastern sky. Ellie had slept only intermittently after the night's events, spending most of the pre-dawn hours monitoring her security feeds and preparing for inevitable repercussions. The failed arson attempt was merely the opening move in what would become a progressively escalating conflict. She had seen this pattern before in contested territories where force met unexpected resistance. After a quick breakfast, she initiated the morning security scan while sipping her coffee. The system reported all defensive measures had reset properly, though the polymer slick behind the barn would need manual neutralization. As she reviewed the footage from last night's encounter, her satellite phone buzzed with an incoming call. "Reeves," she answered, automatically falling back to her maiden name, a telling slip that indicated her mental state. Still answering. "To the old handle, I see," came a familiar voice. "Old habits die hard." Ellie smiled despite herself. "Hello, Mitchell." Colonel Jason Mitchell had been her superior officer and mentor during her final years of government service. Now retired and working as a security consultant, he maintained connections throughout military and intelligence communities and occasionally checked in on his former protégé. "Got an interesting alert this morning," Mitchell said without preamble. "Someone ran facial recognition on the Rawlins gang through federal databases using access codes that were supposed to be deactivated years ago." "Your access codes?" Ellie made no attempt to deny it. "Exceptional circumstances. I gathered as much. Local reports show increased gang activity in your area, and suddenly your dormant security protocols are lighting up our monitoring systems." His tone shifted slightly. "Need assistance?" Not yet, Ellie replied. Just information. What can you tell me about the Westland Development Group? They're operating locally under the name Horizon Estates. The line went quiet for a moment as Mitchell presumably accessed data. Major player in luxury developments across 5 states, clean public record, but my sources suggest connections to certain investment groups known for aggressive acquisition tactics. Their founder and CEO is Richard Westland, former real estate attorney with political aspirations. And links to criminal organizations? Nothing provable, Mitchell answered carefully. But wherever they develop, local crime rates spike during the acquisition phase, then mysteriously resolve once properties are secured. Draw your own conclusions. After sharing additional intelligence about Westland's operations and promising to send secure files on their leadership structure, Mitchell paused. Ellie, if they've hired the Rawlins gang, this isn't just business as usual. Victor Rawlins was in special forces before his dishonorable discharge. He builds tactical teams from ex-military with similar backgrounds. I noticed, Ellie said. Dryly, their approach patterns last night showed training. And they'll adapt quickly after initial failure, Mitchell warned. Watch for escalation. These aren't common criminals who'll be scared off by a single defeat. After ending the call, Ellie spent an hour reviewing the information Mitchell forwarded. Richard Westland's operation was more sophisticated than she had initially assessed, a corporate facade concealing methodical land acquisition through increasingly questionable means. His pattern involved starting with legitimate purchases, then using pressure tactics against holdouts, gradually escalating from financial incentives to intimidation to outright force. Her property, she realized, represented a critical choke point. In their plans, the natural spring that fed her irrigation system controlled water access to nearly 40% of the land Westland sought to develop. Without it, his luxury resort community would require massively expensive water infrastructure, possibly making the entire project economically unfeasible. The sound of an approaching vehicle pulled her attention back to the present. Max Cooper's pickup truck was coming up the drive, followed by his father's larger farm truck. Ellie quickly secured the sensitive files and went out to meet them. "Morning, Mrs. Blackwood," Robert Cooper called as he stepped from his vehicle. Tall and weathered like most longtime farmers, Cooper had been Daniel's friend long before Ellie entered the picture. His concern was evident in the shotgun, visibly mounted in his truck's rear window rack. "Thought we'd stop by and check on you," he continued, eyes scanning the property with obvious concern. "Heard what happened at the miller's place." "I appreciate the thought," Ellie replied, noting with some amusement that Max was trying to subtly examine the barn for signs of the previous night's confrontation. "Coffee's fresh if you'd like some." As they settled at her kitchen table, Cooper got straight to the point. "Sheriff Thompson mentioned you refused his offer of protection. With all due respect, Ellie, that's foolishness. The Rawlins gang isn't known for giving up, and you're out here alone." Ellie poured coffee for her visitors. "I understand the concern, Robert, but I'm better prepared than most." She deliberated briefly before adding, "In fact, they paid me a visit last night." Both Coopers straightened in alarm. "What happened?" Robert demanded. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine," she assured them, "and so is my property. Let's just say they found Blackwood Homestead less vulnerable than anticipated." Before she could elaborate, her security system chimed softly, a specific tone indicating perimeter alerts. Ellie excused herself to check the monitor hidden in the hallway pantry. Multiple vehicles were approaching on the main road, moving at high speed toward her property. "We have company," she announced, returning to the kitchen. "Robert, I think it would be best if you and Max leave through the back road. This might get complicated." Cooper's face hardened. "We're not leaving you to face them alone, Ellie." "I appreciate the sentiment, but—" she began, only to be interrupted by the sound of vehicles turning into her driveway. The security feed showed 3 black SUVs and 2 pickup trucks approaching rapidly, carrying at least a dozen men. "No time to argue," Ellie said, quickly moving to a cabinet and retrieving a worn leather case. "If you're staying, you need to follow my instructions." "Exactly." From the case, she removed 3 small devices resembling hearing aids. "Communication units. Put them in your right ear. They'll allow us to coordinate without shouting." As the Coopers complied, looking both confused and impressed, Ellie continued, issuing rapid instructions. "Max, take a position in the upstairs guest bedroom. The window gives clear sightlines to the main approach. Robert, the tool shed has a reinforced back wall. It provides good cover with escape access to the eastern field if needed." She paused, meeting Cooper's eyes directly. "This is about to become a very unusual situation. Try to keep an open mind." Before either could respond, the vehicle screeched to a halt in her front yard. Men emerged quickly, taking tactical positions around the vehicles. At their center stood Victor Rawlins himself, tall, lean, with the distinctive facial scar that had made him instantly recognizable in database photos. Beside him was Marcus Denton, looking considerably less composed than in previous images, his expression a mixture of anger and lingering disorientation from the previous night's encounter with Ellie's deterrent systems. "Mrs. Blackwood," Rawlins called out, his voice carrying across the yard. "I believe we have some business to discuss." Ellie stepped onto her porch, presenting the image of a concerned but not intimidated homeowner. "I don't believe we've been introduced, Mr. Rawlins." If her knowledge of his name surprised him, Rawlins didn't show it. "I represent parties interested in acquiring your property. I understand there was some confusion last night when my associates attempted to deliver an initial offer. Is that what you call attempted arson these days? An offer?" Ellie's voice remained calm, but her posture subtly shifted to provide better peripheral awareness of all potential threats. Through her earpiece, she could hear Max's controlled breathing from his observation position upstairs. Rawlins spread his hands in a gesture of false reasonableness. "Unfortunate misunderstanding, but I'm here personally now to ensure clarity." His smile didn't reach his eyes. "Horizon Estates is prepared to offer you $200,000 for this property, significantly above market value. I suggest you accept, and if I decline, then things become considerably less pleasant." Rawlins' facade of civility slipped slightly. "Your security tricks might have confused my men last night, but I assure you we're quick learners." As if to emphasize his point, several men began spreading out toward the barn and outbuildings, weapons now visible in their hands. "I see," Ellie replied, "and are Horizon Estates' other land acquisition negotiations typically conducted at gunpoint, Mr. Rawlins?" "This isn't a negotiation," Rawlins stated flatly. "It's a courtesy call before inevitable outcomes. Your choice is simply whether those outcomes include your continued well-being." Ellie allowed a moment of silence to stretch between them, her mind calculating angles, distances, and response options. Then, almost casually, she reached into her pocket and retrieved a small device resembling a key fob. "Before your men take another step," she said clearly, "you should know that Blackwood Homestead is protected by systems significantly more sophisticated than what your team encountered last night." Rawlins sneered. "Lady, whatever home security setup you've got isn't going to impress professional." Ellie pressed the device's central button, cutting him off as the property's primary defense grid activated. Throughout the yard, previously invisible panels opened in the ground, revealing an array of mechanical and electronic countermeasures. Motion tracking devices emerged from concealed housing in trees and fence posts, swiveling to lock onto each intruder. Most dramatically, the seemingly ordinary decorative stone circle in the center of her front yard reconfigured, segments separating and rising to form a miniature turret housing some form of non-standard weapon. The transformation happened in less than 5 seconds, Blackwood homestead shifting from pastoral farm to fortified position with mechanical precision that left Rawlins' men frozen in confusion. Through her earpiece, Ellie heard Max's whispered, "Holy shit," echoing her own thoughts, the first time she had seen Daniel's implementation of her designs in action. "As I was saying," Ellie continued calmly into the stunned silence, "my property is not for sale. Not to Horizon Estates, not to Westland Development Group, not to anyone." For the first time, genuine surprise registered on Rawlins' face at the mention of Westland. The momentary crack in his composure confirmed what Ellie had suspected. The foot soldiers weren't fully informed about who ultimately employed them. "Now," she concluded, "I suggest you and your men return to your vehicles and leave my property immediately. Consider this your only warning." The tense standoff lasted for what seemed like eternity, but was actually less than a minute. Victor Rawlins, a man accustomed to creating fear rather than experiencing it, visibly struggled with the unexpected reversal of power. His eyes darted from one defensive position to another, calculating odds that grew less favorable with each. "Observation. This isn't over," he finally snarled, signaling his men to retreat. "Nobody fortifies like this unless they're hiding something valuable. We'll be back with different tactics." "I'll be here," Ellie replied evenly, maintaining her composed demeanor until the last vehicle disappeared down her driveway. Only then did she allow her shoulders to drop slightly, releasing tension she'd maintained throughout the confrontation. "My God, Ellie," Robert Cooper's voice came from behind her, awe and confusion mingling in his tone. "What was all that? When did you?" He gestured helplessly at the defensive measures now retracting into their concealed positions throughout the property. Max emerged from the house, his youthful face split between excitement and disbelief. "That was the coolest thing I've ever seen. Mrs. Blackwood, you've got a whole military setup here." "Not exactly military," Ellie corrected, ushering them back inside, where they would be less visible to potential observers. "But yes, it's a comprehensive security system." She paused, considering how much to reveal. "Before I married Daniel, I worked in specialized defense design. These systems, they're part of our history together." "Specialized defense design," Robert repeated slowly. "That's quite the understatement from what I just witnessed." His expression shifted from amazement to concern. "Ellie, what Rawlins said about coming back with different tactics, you need to take that seriously. Men like him don't accept defeat." "I know exactly what kind of man Victor Rawlins is," Ellie assured him, bringing coffee mugs to the table. "And I'm preparing accordingly. But there's something larger happening here. This isn't just about my property." She explained what she'd learned about Westland Development Group's pattern of aggressive acquisitions across multiple counties, showing the Coopers the maps and data Mitchell had provided earlier. The broader picture was concerning Redwood. Valley represented just one component of an ambitious development plan that would fundamentally transform 5 rural communities into luxury resorts and exclusive residential enclaves. They've already secured options on 30% of the viable land in this county. Ellie pointed to highlighted sections on the map. The Miller property was key because it controls road access to the Northern Valley. And mine, she traced, the natural spring system that originated on her land, controls water. Robert studied the map, his farmer's understanding of the land adding insight. If they get your water rights and the Hendersons' timber tract, they'd effectively control the entire eastern portion of the county. He looked up, expression grim. The Hendersons had a suspicious equipment fire last week, destroyed their main harvester. Max leaned forward, and the Parkers' fences were cut twice in the last month. Lost half their cattle before they could. "Round them up," It's their standard procedure, Ellie confirmed. Create problems that make continuing operations difficult or unprofitable. Once owners are struggling financially, offer cash buyouts that seem generous under distressed circumstances. So what do we do? Max asked. Before Ellie could respond, the security system chimed with an approaching vehicle alert. The monitor showed Sheriff Thompson's patrol car coming up the drive. "We expand the resistance," Ellie said, rising to meet their visitor. "Starting now." Sheriff Thompson looked harried when he stepped from his vehicle, his normally neat uniform showing signs of a long, difficult day. "Got reports of multiple vehicles heading toward your property," he explained, as Ellie invited him inside. "Wanted. To check." His voice trailed off as he noticed the Coopers at the kitchen table. "You're a bit late, Jim," Robert said. "Rawlins and his crew have already come and gone." Thompson's eyebrows shot up. "They were here. What happened?" "Mrs. Blackwood persuaded them to leave," Max replied with barely concealed excitement. "It was incredible. She's got this whole security system that—" "Max," Ellie interrupted gently, "perhaps I should explain." Over the next 15 minutes, Ellie provided a carefully edited account of both the previous night's attempted arson and the morning's confrontation. She emphasized the criminal actions of the Rawlins gang while downplaying the more classified aspects of her countermeasures. Thompson looked simultaneously impressed and troubled. "I knew Daniel had installed some security after that rash of farm thefts years back, but this sounds considerably more advanced." He studied Ellie with newfound curiosity. "Seems there's more to your background than you've shared with the county." "Mrs. Blackwood, there's more to everyone's background, Sheriff," she replied diplomatically, "but right now we need to focus on the larger threat to this community." Thompson nodded, his lawman's pragmatism asserting itself. "The Rawlins gang has been a growing problem, but linking them directly to Horizon Estates would require evidence I don't have yet." "Then we need to get that evidence," Robert interjected. "If what Ellie's showing us is accurate, half the county is under threat from these developers and their hired muscle." "We need to warn people," Max added. "Let everyone know what's really happening." Ellie raised a cautioning hand. "We need to be strategic. If we publicly challenge Westland development without solid evidence, they'll simply deny everything and accelerate their timeline. And warning people without offering protection could just spread panic." "What do you suggest?" Thompson asked. "A coordinated approach," Ellie replied, years of tactical planning evident in her calm analysis. "Sheriff, you continue building legal evidence against the Rawlins gang. Robert, you have connections throughout the farming community. Identify the most likely next targets and quietly inform trusted neighbors about what's happening." "And me?" Max asked eagerly. Ellie smiled slightly. "You help me design expandable security systems that can be quickly implemented on vulnerable properties." "So we're forming some kind of resistance?" Thompson asked skeptically. "Vigilante action isn't exactly something I can officially support, Ellie." "Not vigilantes," she corrected. "Community defense. There's a critical distinction. We're not taking offensive action against anyone. We're simply protecting private property from criminal activity when law enforcement resources are insufficient." The discussion continued for another hour, evolving from concept to practical planning. By the time Thompson departed, they had established the framework for a coordinated response to Westland's pressure tactics. Robert would convene a select group of trusted landowners that evening at his farm. Thompson would quietly redirect patrol resources to cover properties most likely to be targeted next. And Ellie would begin adapting simplified versions of her defensive systems for rapid deployment. As the men prepared to leave, Ellie retrieved several small devices from her workshop. "Perimeter sensors," she explained, handing them to Robert. "Place them around your property, especially approaching your main barn and house. They'll detect unauthorized movement and alert you through this receiver." She handed him a pager-like device. "It's not a comprehensive system, but it's better than nothing until we can implement something more robust." Robert accepted the equipment with a nod of appreciation. Never thought I'd see the day when farmers needed military-grade security. What's happening to this country, Ellie? The same thing that's happened throughout history, she replied quietly. Resources become valuable, and those with power attempt to control them. The only variable is whether communities stand together or allow themselves to be divided. After the Coopers departed, Ellie spent the afternoon preparing for the evening meeting. She compiled simplified schematics for basic defensive measures that could be implemented with commonly available farm materials, created maps identifying vulnerable points on neighboring properties, and assembled emergency security kits for immediate distribution. As she worked, her satellite phone buzzed with another incoming call from Mitchell. "You've stirred up something interesting," he said without greeting. "Westland Development Group made 3 calls to former military contractors within hours of your confrontation with Rawlins. They're bringing in specialized personnel." Ellie paused in her preparations. "What kind of specialization?" "The kind with experience in counterinsurgency and rural pacification," Mitchell replied grimly. "Ex-military with combat deployments and specialized training in neutralizing resistance. These aren't common thugs like the Rawlins crew, Ellie. They're professionals with advanced tactical training. Timeline: 24 to 48 hours before they're operational in your area. Westland's accelerating dramatically. Whatever you've got there, they want it badly enough to skip several steps in their usual acquisition pattern." Ellie absorbed this information, mentally adjusting her plans. "I need equipment, Jason, more than I currently have on site." "Already in motion," he assured her. "Called in some favors. You'll have a delivery tonight. Coordinates programmed into your secure GPS. Standard deniability protocols apply." "Understood." She hesitated briefly. "This is escalating beyond what local resources can handle." "That's they're counting on," Mitchell confirmed. "Create a situation beyond local law enforcement capabilities, then insert their solution. Classic destabilize and control methodology." After ending the call, Ellie stood at her kitchen window, watching the afternoon sun cast long shadows across her property. The personal confrontation with Rawlins had transformed into something far larger, a community under threat from forces most residents barely comprehended. Her training and experience had prepared her to defend herself, but extending that protection to an entire rural community presented challenges beyond anything she had previously attempted. As dusk approached, Ellie loaded her truck with the prepared security kits and defensive schematics. Tonight's meeting would transform individual concern into collective action, ordinary farmers and ranchers unified against extraordinary threats. Whether her leadership would prove sufficient to counter Westland's resources remained to be seen, but Eleanor Reeves had never been one to calculate odds when principles were at stake. The battle for Blackwood Homestead had evolved into the defense of Redwood Valley itself. The meeting at Cooper's farm exceeded Ellie's expectations. 23 landowners gathered in the spacious barn, their faces a mixture of concern, determination, and skepticism. Robert had selected carefully. Each person present owned property crucial to Westland's development plans and had experienced some form of intimidation or sabotage in recent weeks. Ellie stood before the improvised assembly, the former military engineer temporarily visible behind the widow's calm exterior as she systematically outlined what they faced. Using a projector connected to her laptop, she displayed maps, property records, and documented patterns of Westland's operations in other communities. "This isn't random criminal activity," she explained, highlighting targeted properties across the county. "It's coordinated pressure designed to devalue land and force distressed sales. The fire at the Miller farm, the equipment sabotage at Henderson's timber operation, the cattle releases from Parker's ranch, all strategically selected. to undermine key properties that control access, resources, or transit routes. Samuel Henderson, a weathered timberman in his 60s, spoke up from the back row. "We've faced developers before. What makes these folks different?" "Scale and methodology," Ellie replied, switching to satellite imagery, showing transformed communities in neighboring states. Westland doesn't just build homes or businesses. They completely reconstitute rural areas into luxury enclaves, golf courses, private airstrips, exclusive shopping districts, and they employ progressive force to secure properties that won't sell willingly. She outlined the security measures she proposed, simplified versions of her own defensive systems adapted for rapid deployment with minimal technical expertise required. The basic packages included perimeter sensors, alarm systems, and non-lethal deterrents that could be installed within hours. "This won't stop determined professionals," she cautioned, "but it will provide warning and help document illegal activities. More importantly, it establishes that we're not isolated targets, but a coordinated community response." Sheriff Thompson, standing at the back of the barn, added his perspective. "I've requested additional deputies from the state, but approval takes time we may not have. In the meantime, I'm establishing dedicated patrols focused on the most vulnerable properties." By meeting's end, 19 homeowners had accepted Ellie's security packages and formed a communication network for rapid response to any incidents. 4 volunteers with military or law enforcement backgrounds agreed to serve as sector coordinators, creating a structured system for monitoring suspicious activities across the county. It was nearly midnight when Ellie returned to Blackwood Homestead. As she turned onto her private road, her headlights illuminated a nondescript delivery van parked at the designated coordinates Mitchell had provided. There was no driver visible. Standard protocol for sensitive equipment deliveries. The vehicle's rear compartment contained several reinforced cases with military markings obscured by black paint. Using a specialized hand truck from her own supplies, Ellie transferred the cases to her barn workshop, working methodically despite her fatigue. Inside, she found exactly what she'd requested: advanced surveillance equipment, specialized non-lethal defensive devices and communication systems secure from conventional monitoring. Most importantly, the shipment included 6 prototype autonomous security units, cutting-edge technology she had helped design before leaving government service. These ASUs represented the culmination of her work in adaptive defensive systems, softball-sized. Spheres containing sophisticated sensors, limited mobility mechanisms, and non-lethal response capabilities. Properly programmed and positioned, they formed an intelligent defensive perimeter that could identify threats and respond with escalating deterrence measures. Ellie worked through the night, integrating the new equipment into her existing security grid and preparing deployment packages for the most vulnerable neighboring properties. As dawn approached, she finally allowed herself 2 hours of sleep before the day's challenges would begin. The sun had barely cleared the horizon when her security system chimed with multiple proximity alerts. Instantly alert, Ellie activated her surveillance monitors to find an unexpected scene unfolding. 4 black SUVs with government markings had established a checkpoint on the county road approaching her property. Men in tactical gear were stopping vehicles, checking identification, and turning away anyone attempting to visit the area. Her satellite phone rang almost immediately. "They're moving faster than anticipated," Mitchell said without preamble. "Those aren't actual federal agents. They're private contractors, using government-style vehicles and equipment, a tactic Westland has employed before to establish illegal checkpoints in rural areas." "Creating isolation before the main assault," Ellie concluded, recognizing the strategy. "Cut off communications, prevent community response, then apply maximum pressure on individual targets." "Exactly. And that's not all. Satellite imagery shows helicopter activity at the abandoned lumber mill 10 miles north of your position. They're establishing a forward operating base with at least 30 personnel. Ellie's mind rapidly processed the tactical implications. They're planning a coordinated multi-point assault. The Rawlins gang was just the preliminary test of defenses. Assessment confirmed, Mitchell replied. My sources indicate they'll move within 24 hours, likely using the Rawlins crew as a diversionary element while their professional team executes the primary operation. After ending the call, Ellie activated the emergency communication network established at the previous night's meeting. Checkpoint established on County Road 23, she reported. False government credentials being used to restrict access. All sector coordinators implement the communication protocol Delta. Protocol Delta involved switching to the secure radio system she had distributed, bypassing potentially compromised cell networks and establishing direct communication between allied properties. Within minutes, reports began flowing in. Similar checkpoints had appeared on 5 major access roads throughout the county, effectively isolating the core properties in Westland's acquisition zone. Ellie made a rapid decision. Accelerated implementation required, she announced through the secure channel. All available installation teams proceed to priority properties immediately. For the next 4 hours, Ellie coordinated a frantic effort to deploy defensive systems across key locations before Westland's forces could move. The teams she had trained the previous evening worked with remarkable efficiency, installing perimeter sensors, surveillance cameras, and basic deterrence devices on 8 properties identified as likely primary targets. At Blackwood Homestead, Ellie implemented far more extensive preparations. She deployed the 6 ASUs at strategic points around her property, each programmed with escalating response protocols and networked to her central command system. Additional defensive measures were activated, including underground sensors capable of detecting approach vehicles well beyond visual range. By mid-afternoon, the communication network reported increasing activity around the perimeter of the isolated zone. Vehicles matching those used by the Rawlins gang were gathering at multiple points, while helicopter reconnaissance had been observed over at least 4 properties. They're conducting final surveillance before the operation, Ellie informed the network coordinators. Expected engagement after nightfall, all defensive systems to full alert status. As dusk approached, Ellie completed her preparations. The reinforced command center beneath her barn was fully operational, monitoring feeds from throughout the defensive network. Each allied property now showed as an illuminated point on her tactical display, their status updated in real time through the secure communication system. The first movement came precisely at 9:17 p.m. Multiple vehicles approached the Cooper farm from the north, moving without headlights across open fields rather than using established roads. Simultaneously, Ellie's perimeter sensors detected 3 separate groups converging on Blackwood Homestead, a classic pincer movement designed to divide defensive attention. Contact imminent at Cooper location, she announced through the network. Initiate defensive protocol Alpha. On her monitor, she watched as the Cooper Farm's newly installed security system activated automatically. Floodlights suddenly illuminated the approaching vehicles, while a recorded announcement warned that they were trespassing on private property under electronic surveillance. This basic deterrence was precisely what they had practiced. Identify, document, and establish clear legal boundaries before any escalation. The response from the intruders was immediate and disproportionate. Automatic weapons fire erupted, systematically destroying the lighting and speaker systems. This wasn't the Rawlins gang's usual intimidation tactics. It was professional, coordinated suppressive fire designed to neutralize security systems. Before a primary assault, Cooper location under direct fire, Robert's voice came through the communication system, remarkably steady despite the chaos audible in the background. They've disabled the exterior deterrents and are approaching the main barn. These aren't Rawlins' men. They're using military tactics. Understood, Ellie replied, making a rapid decision. Activate secondary defensive measures. Sheriff Thompson has been notified with video evidence of armed assault. The secondary measures at Cooper's farm were more sophisticated, electromagnetic, countermeasures that disabled vehicle electronics and communication systems within a 200-yard radius. On Ellie's monitor, she saw the approaching vehicles suddenly stall, their electrical systems overwhelmed by the targeted EMP device she had installed in the barn's hayloft. Simultaneously, her own property's perimeter alerts reached critical levels. The three approaching groups had reached her outer defensive boundary, moving with the coordinated precision that confirmed Mitchell's intelligence. These were professionals with tactical training, not common criminals. Full defensive activation authorized, Ellie spoke clearly, engaging the command sequence that brought Blackwood Homestead's complete security system online. What followed would later be described by witnesses as something out of a science fiction movie. The property's integrated defensive grid activated in synchronized sequence, starting with environmental manipulation systems that immediately transformed the physical terrain. Irrigation channels redirected thousands of gallons of water to create impassable muddy zones in approaching paths. Concealed terrain features suddenly became obstacles as hidden barriers rose from seemingly solid ground. The autonomous security units deployed their full capabilities, moving to intercept approaching threats with an array of non-lethal countermeasures. Disorienting light patterns, targeted sound deterrents, and precision deployment of gas-based irritants created zones of progressive incapacitation around the property's core buildings. Most dramatically, the barn, the most likely target for arson or sabotage, revealed its complete defensive integration. Panels in the structure's exterior opened to deploy a protective shield, combining fire-retardant systems and ballistic mesh, designed to withstand substantial damage while maintaining structural integrity. From her command center, Ellie monitored both her property's defense and the status of allied locations throughout the network. The coordinated community response had caught Westland's operatives by surprise. Instead of isolated vulnerable targets, they faced an integrated defensive system spanning multiple properties with real-time coordination. At Blackwood Homestead, the confrontation reached its peak as the assault team's commander attempted to rally his forces for a concentrated push toward the barn. Ellie watched through night vision cameras as a tall figure in tactical gear directed his team toward what appeared to be a gap in the defensive measures. Sector 7 breach attempt, she noted calmly, entering commands to activate the property's most sophisticated countermeasure. The ground beneath the advancing team suddenly transformed, not with water or physical barriers, but with a specialized polymer compound released from concealed reservoirs. The substance expanded rapidly upon contact with air, creating a foam-like material that engulfed everything in its path. Within seconds, the entire assault team was effectively immobilized, trapped in rapidly hardening material specifically designed for non-lethal personnel containment. As Sheriff's Department vehicles approached, with sirens wailing, Ellie allowed herself a moment of grim satisfaction. The defensive systems she and Daniel had created had just faced their most significant test and performed exactly as designed. The battle for Blackwood Homestead had been joined in earnest, and the first decisive engagement had gone to the defender. The aftermath of the failed assault brought a flurry of activity to Redwood Valley. Sheriff Thompson's deputies documented evidence at multiple properties, photographing disabled vehicles, collecting abandoned tactical gear, and recording statements from targeted landowners. By dawn, State police had arrived, establishing perimeters around the false checkpoints and detaining several Westland operatives who hadn't managed to escape during the night. Ellie stood in her yard, watching as forensic teams examined the hardened polymer compound that still encased weapons and equipment abandoned by the assault team. The attackers themselves had been extracted and taken into custody, their identities now being processed through federal databases. Her satellite phone buzzed with an incoming call from Mitchell. "You've created quite a situation," he said, a note of admiration in his voice. "Westland's operatives are scrambling. 3 helicopters departed their forward base at 0400 hours, heading east with all remaining personnel." "They're regrouping, not retreating," Ellie replied, watching as technicians carefully collected samples of her defensive materials. "This was just the first attempt." "Agreed, but you've bought valuable time. My contacts at the Bureau have taken interest. Armed mercenaries establishing false checkpoints across several federal jurisdictions. They're sending a special response team that should arrive by noon." After ending the call, Ellie approached Sheriff Thompson, who was coordinating the investigation from a mobile command center established in her driveway. 7 properties targeted simultaneously, he informed her, pointing to a map marked with incident locations. All with the same pattern: disable security systems, neutralize communications, then converge on primary structures. If you hadn't implemented those defensive measures, he shook his head grimly, this could have been a very different morning. "Any word on Richard Westland's location?" Ellie asked. "Nothing confirmed, but we've issued alerts to neighboring jurisdictions." Thompson's expression darkened. The deputies who raided their local office found it completely abandoned. Computers removed, files gone. They'd been preparing for this contingency. A commotion at the property entrance drew their attention. A convoy of vehicles was approaching, not law enforcement, but a procession of news vans from regional media outlets. Thompson swore under his breath. Someone leaked the situation to the press. This complicates things. Ellie watched as reporters began setting up equipment just beyond the police barricade. Actually, this might work to our advantage. Westland operates best in the shadows. Public scrutiny disrupts their typical methods. Before she could elaborate, Robert Cooper arrived, his truck coated with mud from back roads used to bypass the now disbanded checkpoints. "You need to see this," he said without greeting, handing Ellie a thick file folder. "Found it in a hidden safe behind the fireplace at the property Horizon Estates was using as their local office. Max and I went to check for damage after last night's chaos and found the place ransacked. Looks like they left in a hurry and missed this." Inside the folder, Ellie discovered geological surveys, water testing reports, and mineral assay results, all focused on a specific region that included her property and several neighboring parcels. The technical data was accompanied by correspondence between Westland executives and representatives from Montgomery Resource Extraction, one of the largest mining conglomerates in North America. "This isn't about luxury housing developments," she murmured, scanning the documents. "They've discovered something in the Redwood Valley Basin, something valuable enough to justify their extraordinary measures." Further examination confirmed her suspicion. The surveys indicated substantial deposits of rare earth elements, critical for advanced electronics and renewable energy technologies. More specifically, the highest concentration centered precisely beneath Blackwood Homestead and extended under adjacent properties, with her natural spring system providing ideal access points for extraction operations. "Does this change your security assessment?" Thompson asked, examining the documents over her shoulder. "Significantly," Ellie confirmed. "This explains their accelerated timeline and willingness to employ direct force. Mineral rights this valuable would justify considerably more aggressive tactics than what we've seen so far." As they discussed implications, a black SUV with federal government markings approached the property entrance. Two agents in suits emerged, displaying credentials that prompted the sheriff's deputies to admit them immediately. Their demeanor suggested senior authority, straight-backed and observant, taking in details with practiced efficiency. "Mrs. Eleanor Blackwood," the female agent inquired as they approached. "I'm Special Agent Diana Kruger, FBI Critical Infrastructure Protection Division. This is my colleague, Agent Marcus Harrington." Ellie shook their hands, noting the specialized division assignment with interest. Critical infrastructure protection typically handled threats to strategic national resources, not rural property. "Disputes. We understand you've experienced an organized assault on your property," Kruger continued, her tone professional but with an undercurrent of urgency. "Our preliminary assessment suggests this incident may have national security implications." Thompson looked surprised. "National security? This is a land development dispute that escalated to criminal activity. Serious, certainly, but hardly." "Sheriff, may we speak with Mrs. Blackwood privately?" Agent Harrington interrupted politely but firmly. Once inside her kitchen, away from other investigators and the distant press corps, the agent's demeanor shifted subtly. "Mrs. Blackwood, we're aware of your previous work for the Defense Department," Kruger stated without preamble. "Your security expertise is well documented in classified archives." Ellie maintained a neutral expression. "My past. Employment isn't relevant to the current situation." "On the contrary," Harrington countered, placing a tablet on the table and activating a secure file. "Geological surveys conducted by the USGS 3 years ago identified this region as containing one of the largest undiscovered deposits of strategic minerals in the continental United States, specifically elements crucial for next-generation defense technologies." The screen displayed maps remarkably similar to those in the folder Cooper had delivered, but with additional security classifications and military applications noted. "The government has been monitoring this area discreetly," Kruger explained, "planning for eventual national resource development under controlled conditions. However, 6 months ago, our surveillance detected unauthorized geological testing being conducted under the guise of environmental studies." "Westland Development," Ellie concluded. "Exactly. Their founder, Richard Westland, has concerns about connections to foreign investment groups with ties to hostile governments. If they secured control of these mineral deposits, critical materials could be channeled to entities developing weapons systems that directly threaten U.S. interests." The implications crystallized in Ellie's mind. Her property wasn't just valuable real estate or even merely valuable for its mineral deposits. It represented a strategic resource with national security implications. Westland's aggressive acquisition tactics suddenly made perfect sense. They were racing against inevitable government intervention once the resource's significance became widely recognized. "There's more," Harrington continued, swiping to another document on the tablet. "Intelligence suggests Westland isn't the principal in this operation. He's acting as an intermediary for Archer Global Resources, a multinational corporation with a documented history of exploitative extraction practices in developing nations." "The shell company structure," Ellie noted, remembering Mitchell's intelligence on Westland's operation. "Multiple layers of corporate entities hiding the true interested parties." "Precisely. Archer operates through at least 17 different subsidiaries and investment vehicles to obscure their activities." Kruger's expression was grim. "Their typical methodology involves securing resource-rich properties through any means necessary, extracting maximum value with minimal environmental considerations, then abandoning the depleted sites to local jurisdictions." Ellie processed this information, connecting it with what she had already uncovered. "The spring system on my property. It's not just about water access for development. It provides natural channels to the mineral deposits without extensive drilling, making your land the linchpin for any extraction operation," Harrington confirmed. With your property secured, accessing the entire deposit becomes exponentially easier and more cost-effective, which explains why they escalated to direct assault when intimidation failed, Ellie concluded. The potential profit justifies extraordinary measures. Kruger nodded soberly. Our analysts estimate the deposit value exceeds $9 billion at current market rates. And given increasing technology demands, that value will only appreciate. The conversation was interrupted by Thompson entering with urgent news. Just received word from state police. Richard Westland's private jet filed a flight plan from the county airfield. Departure in 90 minutes. Kruger immediately activated her secure communication device. We need that aircraft grounded and all passengers detained for questioning. Priority authorization, Sierra 7 Delta. As the agent coordinated the response, Ellie examined the geological surveys more carefully, her engineering background allowing her to recognize implications others might miss. The mineral deposit's structure created unique vulnerabilities. Accessing it improperly could potentially contaminate the aquifer system supplying water to 3 counties. Agent Kruger, she said as the call concluded, these deposits are integrated with the regional water table in a way that makes conventional extraction extremely hazardous. If Westland or Archer attempted rapid extraction methods, environmental catastrophe, Kruger finished grimly. We've had our geologists review the data. That's precisely why this situation escalated to our division. It's not just about resource control, it's about preventing potential damage to critical infrastructure. The pieces now fit together with disturbing clarity. Westland's operation wasn't simply about acquiring valuable property, it was about securing access to strategic resources before government oversight could be established, allowing extraction methods that prioritize speed and profit over environmental safety. Ellie glanced through her kitchen window at the news crews still gathering beyond her property line. The media presence might be useful after all. Public exposure of Westland's connections to Archer Global would complicate their ability to operate covertly. Harrington nodded thoughtfully. Strategic disclosure could help establish a buffer against further direct action. If you're willing, a carefully structured interview might serve both your immediate security concerns and our longer-term monitoring objectives. As Ellie considered this approach, her secure communication system chimed with incoming alerts from the network she had established. Multiple properties were reporting suspicious activities, not direct confrontation, but evidence of surveillance. Resuming at observation points throughout the valley, they're not retreating, she informed the agents, displaying the incoming data on her security monitors. This is a standard reaction to initial failure. Reassess, identify weaknesses, develop countermeasures. Westland may be attempting to flee, but Archer's operational elements are still active. Agent Kruger studied the surveillance reports with professional interest. Their persistence confirms our assessment of the deposit's value. This won't end with Westland's detention or even public exposure of Archer's involvement. No, Ellie agreed, her military training asserting itself as she analyzed the evolving threat landscape. This has only begun. The hidden agenda behind the attacks on Redwood Valley had been revealed. Not simple land development or even conventional resource extraction, but a strategic play for materials crucial to national interests. What had started as defense of a widow's homestead had evolved into protection of critical infrastructure with international implications. And Eleanor Blackwood, former military engineer, grieving widow, reluctant community leader, now found herself at the center of a conflict far beyond what anyone in Redwood Valley could have anticipated. A temporary command center materialized in Ellie's barn with remarkable efficiency. FBI technicians established secure communications, while geological specialists pored over maps of the mineral deposits. Sheriff Thompson coordinated with state police to maintain perimeters around key properties, and Ellie's network of local landowners continued monitoring for suspicious activities throughout the valley. "Richard Westland is in custody," Agent Kruger announced, returning from a secure call outside. "Apprehended at the airfield with 3 executives and digital storage devices. Initial review indicates extensive documentation of Archer Global's involvement." Ellie nodded, but her focus remained on the tactical display, showing surveillance reports from throughout Redwood Valley. That won't stop their operational elements. The personnel who retreated from last night's failed assault are regrouping, not withdrawing. "Agreed," Harrington confirmed, studying satellite imagery on his tablet. "We've identified increased activity at 3 locations within 50 miles. Thermal signatures suggest between 30 and 40 individuals with vehicle support." The barn door opened as Robert Cooper arrived, with Max and 4 other local men who had emerged as leaders in the community defense network. Their expressions showed a mixture of determination and concern as they took in the transformed space. Ellie's workshop, now resembling a military operations center. "We've got movement at the old Whitaker property," Robert reported without preamble. 2 unmarked vans arrived about 20 minutes ago, men in tactical gear unloading equipment. The Whitaker place gives them elevated positions overlooking 5 access roads, Max added, pointing to locations on the tactical map. "Perfect staging area for coordinated movement." Ellie studied the positioning with professional assessment. "They're establishing a forward operations base closer than the lumber mill. Shorter response time, better tactical positioning." She turned to the federal agents. "When can we expect additional federal resources?" "Tactical response team is 6 hours out," Kruger replied. "Helicopter support is possible in 4, but weather systems moving in might complicate air operations." The implied timeline hung heavily in the air. Archer's operatives were positioning now, while significant federal support remained hours away. The night's successful defense had bought time and created confusion, but professional mercenaries would adapt quickly, developing countermeasures to the defensive systems that had thwarted their initial assault. "We need to transition from reactive to proactive posture," Ellie stated, years of military planning evident in her calm analysis. "They've identified our defensive capabilities and will have developed specialized countermeasures. Their next attempt will be precisely targeted to neutralize specific systems before engaging primary objectives." "What do you suggest?" Thompson asked. "We're stretched thin, covering all vulnerable properties." Ellie moved to the central map table, indicating key locations throughout the valley. "We consolidate resources, establish defensive depth at critical points, and implement deliberate deception measures to channel their approach along predictable vectors." Over the next hour, Ellie outlined a comprehensive counter-strategy that incorporated both her specialized knowledge and the locals' intimate familiarity with the terrain. Properties adjacent to critical water access points would receive enhanced defensive systems. Communication networks would shift frequencies at predetermined intervals to prevent signal interception. Most importantly, they would create deliberate visual indicators of defensive concentrations at locations that actually contained minimal resources. A classic military deception to divert enemy forces from true objectives. Essentially, we're creating a valley-wide defensive grid with apparent vulnerabilities that are actually carefully prepared engagement zones, she explained, using a laser pointer to indicate specific choke points where attacking forces could be channeled and contained. The sheriff looked skeptical. "That's assuming they'll fall for the deception. These aren't amateurs we're dealing with." "True," Ellie acknowledged, "but even professionals respond to visual indicators under time pressure. They know federal resources are inbound, which compresses their operational window. That creates predictable decision patterns we can exploit." As the tactical planning continued, Max approached Ellie with uncharacteristic hesitation. "Mrs. Blackwood, There's something I need to show you. He glanced at the federal agents, privately, if possible. Intrigued, Ellie followed him to the far corner of the barn where he retrieved a battered laptop from his backpack. "Been working on something since you gave us those security systems," he explained, opening the computer to reveal lines of code. "Modified the detection algorithms to create a distributed mesh network across all our properties. Each sensor not only reports locally, but shares data with adjacent systems." Ellie examined the code with growing appreciation. "This is impressive. Work, Max. Where did you learn system architecture like this?" He shrugged, a hint of embarrassment coloring his features. "MIT online courses. Been studying computer science in my spare time. Dad thinks I'm just playing games, but..." He gestured to the screen. "I figured this might help coordinate our defenses." "It does more than that," Ellie replied, genuinely impressed. "You've essentially created a counter-surveillance system that could detect pattern movement across multiple properties simultaneously." She studied him with newfound respect. "Would you be willing to implement this immediately?" Max nodded eagerly. "Already uploaded to 15 properties. Just need access to your central system to integrate the data streams." While Max worked on the integration, Ellie rejoined the main planning session where Robert was distributing specialized equipment to the local defense coordinators. Hardened communication devices, night vision capabilities, and non-lethal deterrent systems adapted from her designs. "Remember, documentation is critical," Thompson emphasized to the assembled group. "Every defensive action must be clearly recorded as responding to illegal trespass or direct threat. We maintain the legal high ground at all times." Agent Kruger approached Ellie with updates from federal resources. "Intercepted communications confirm what you suspected. Archer's operational head, a former Special Forces commander named Adrian Blackburn, has taken direct control after Westland's detention. He's known for aggressive tactics and specialized in resource extraction security in conflict zones." Escalation was inevitable, Ellie noted, accepting the intelligence briefing with practiced calm. Blackburn's background suggests he'll favor direct action over continued subterfuge, likely a multi-pronged assault focusing on key infrastructure rather than property acquisition. "That aligns with our profile," Kruger agreed. "He typically targets communication networks and water resources simultaneously, creating confusion while establishing control of critical access points." This assessment confirmed Ellie's strategic approach. Their defensive preparations now concentrated on protecting the valley's water infrastructure, springs, pumping stations, and reservoir controls, rather than individual homesteads. By securing these critical resources, they could prevent Archer from establishing the leverage needed for mineral extraction operations. As afternoon faded toward evening, the temporary command center transformed into a bustling deployment hub. Local volunteers with military or law enforcement experience received specialized assignments based on their backgrounds. Ellie's remaining autonomous security units were programmed for deployment at critical choke points, while surveillance drones established continuous monitoring of likely approach routes. "Mrs. Blackwood," Agent Harrington called, gesturing toward a secure communication console. "Colonel Mitchell for you." Ellie accepted the encrypted call, grateful for her former mentor's continued support. "Jason, what's your assessment?" "Satellite. Imagery confirms significant mercenary presence converging on your region," Mitchell replied, his voice distorted slightly by the secure connection. "Tactical profile suggests they're preparing for coordinated assault across multiple vectors, likely commencing after midnight." Expected composition? Former military contractors, primarily with extraction zone experience. Equipment includes advanced countermeasures for automated security systems, signal jammers, thermal masking, specialized breaching tools. They've adapted quickly from the initial failure. Ellie processed this information, mentally adjusting defensive allocations. Any indication of their primary targets? Intelligence suggests a two-phase operation, Mitchell replied. Initial actions targeting communication infrastructure and security systems, followed by direct assault on your property specifically. Blackburn apparently became fixated on the spring system once he understood its connection to the mineral deposits. After concluding the call, Ellie gathered the core defense team for final preparations. The sun had set, casting long shadows across the valley as property owners returned to their designated positions. FBI technicians completed installation of enhanced monitoring systems, while Sheriff Thompson's deputies established checkpoints at strategic road junctions. We have approximately 6 hours before likely engagement, Ellie informed the assembled group. All defensive systems are operational, communication networks secure, and documentation systems active. Federal tactical response will arrive by dawn, but we need to maintain defensive integrity until then. Robert Cooper studied the valley map with the grim expression of a man preparing to defend his livelihood. Think we can hold out that long against professional mercenaries? We're not trying to defeat them conventionally, Ellie replied, indicating the integrated defensive grid they had established. Our objective is controlled channeling of their forces into prepared containment zones where their advantages are neutralized. We don't need to win. We just need to prevent them from securing critical resources until federal authorities can establish jurisdiction. Max looked up from his monitoring station, where the integrated sensor network now displayed. Comprehensive surveillance across the entire valley. First perimeter alert, he reported, pointing to a flashing indicator on the northern boundary. Vehicle convoy moving along the logging road, lights disabled. And so it begins, Ellie murmured, watching as additional indicators appeared at widely separated points around Redwood Valley. Establish passive monitoring only, no active countermeasures until they commit to specific approach vectors. As the defense team dispersed to their assigned positions, Ellie performed a final check of her own property's systems. Blackwood Homestead represented both her personal sanctuary and the strategic center of their defensive network. Its protection was paramount not just for emotional reasons, but because the sophisticated command and control systems it housed coordinated the entire valley's defense. From a concealed compartment beneath her workbench, she retrieved Daniel's service pistol, a tangible connection to the husband whose vision had helped create the integrated security systems now protecting an entire community. She checked it meticulously before securing it in a holster at the small of her back. Didn't think I'd need this again, she whispered, memories of their shared work flooding back as she activated the final defense protocols. But we built this place to last, didn't we? As darkness settled completely over Redwood Valley, Eleanor Blackwood, widow, engineer, and now defender, took her position at the command console. The monitors displayed approaching threats from multiple directions, mercenary forces converging with professional precision on targets throughout the community. The preliminary skirmishes had tested capabilities on both sides. The coming confrontation would determine the fate not just of her homestead, but of the entire valley and the strategic resources beneath it. Technical expertise had created their defensive capabilities, but community solidarity would determine whether they endured the night. Ellie's voice was calm as she issued the final preparation order across the secure network. All units maintain communications discipline. Engage only when targets enter designated containment zones. Remember, we're not just protecting property, we're defending our community against those who would exploit it and abandon it. The counterattack preparation was complete. All that remained was to execute the plan against adversaries whose resources, training, and determination should have made them unbeatable, if not for one critical miscalculation. They had dismissed Redwood Valley as simply another rural community, ripe for exploitation, never suspecting that a former military engineer had transformed it into one of the most sophisticated defensive grids. Outside classified government installations, their error would prove costly. The command center beneath Ellie's barn hummed with tense activity as the digital map displayed multiple approaching threats. Max's sensor network had transformed their defensive capabilities, providing real-time intelligence across the entire valley. 3 separate mercenary teams were now converging on predetermined targets exactly as Ellie had predicted. Northern team approaching the water treatment facility, Max reported, his young voice steady despite the pressure. 8 individuals, heavy equipment packages, moving in standard tactical formation. Eastern team has reached the Henderson timberline, came Robert's voice through the secure communication system. They're deploying what looks like signal jamming equipment. Our mesh network is compensating, but local communications are degrading. Ellie studied the movement patterns, recognizing the professional methodology behind them. Blackburn was implementing classic infrastructure targeting, neutralize communications first, then secure water resources, creating leverage over the entire community. The approach was textbook special operations, refined through decades of resource conflicts worldwide. All defensive coordinators maintain Protocol Echo, she instructed through the encrypted channel. Passive monitoring only until hostiles commit to prepared engagement zones. Protocol Echo represented the core of their counter-strategy. Allow hostile forces to penetrate outer perimeters, creating the illusion of successful advance while actually channeling them into carefully prepared containment areas. Each apparent vulnerability in their defensive network had been deliberately engineered to entice specific tactical responses. Agent Kruger monitored federal support communications from a separate console. Weather system has grounded air support, she reported grimly. Ground units are proceeding, but still approximately 4 hours from effective deployment. We'll hold, Ellie replied with quiet confidence, though she recognized the significant challenge they faced. Archer's mercenaries possessed superior numbers, equipment, and tactical training. Their advantage lay solely in preparation, terrain, knowledge, and the integrated defensive systems now deployed throughout the valley. At precisely 1:23 a.m., the assault began in earnest. The northern team initiated a coordinated attack on the water treatment facility, deploying specialized breaching equipment against the reinforced doors, while suppressive fire targeted the security cameras. Simultaneously, the eastern team disabled the main power relay station, serving 3 properties, plunging that sector into darkness, save for emergency backup systems. They're moving exactly as anticipated, Ellie noted with professional assessment. Proceeding to second phase containment. The second phase of their defensive strategy now activated automatically. As power failed across the eastern sector, concealed generators engaged, powering not just essential services, but also activating defensive measures specifically designed to operate during power disruption. Motion-activated barriers emerged from seemingly ordinary landscaping features, while terrain that appeared solid suddenly revealed prepared defensive positions. On the command center's main display, Ellie watched as the northern team breached the water facility's outer security, moving with practiced efficiency toward control systems, only to trigger specialized countermeasures. Non-toxic but highly effective disorientation gas released from ventilation systems, while strobe lighting activated at frequencies calculated to induce temporary sensory confusion without causing permanent harm. Northern team containment was successful, reported Samuel Henderson, the retired military officer coordinating that sector's defense. 7 individuals contained within the facility's secondary security zone, 1 remaining outside attempting communications, Maintain isolation protocol, Ellie instructed. Document everything for federal prosecution. The Eastern team's progress similarly stalled as they encountered escalating defensive measures unlike anything in their experience. What had appeared to be vulnerable power infrastructure had actually been decoupled from critical systems days earlier, creating an attractive but ultimately meaningless target. A sudden alert from Max's monitoring system drew Ellie's attention to the southern approach. "New contacts," he reported tensely. "Larger force than anticipated. 12 individuals with heavy equipment approaching directly toward Blackwood Homestead. Different movement patterns from other teams." Ellie immediately recognized the tactical significance. "That's Blackburn himself," she stated with certainty. "The other teams are diversionary. This is the main assault force targeting the spring system." The realization confirmed her earlier assessment. Adrian Blackburn, recognizing the strategic importance of the natural springs that provided direct access to the mineral deposits, had committed his most experienced personnel to securing that specific objective. The attacks on other infrastructure were meant to divide defensive attention and resources. "All coordinators maintain current positions," she instructed through the command channel. "Southern approach is primary. Repeat, southern approach is primary." Ellie activated Blackwood Homestead's most sophisticated defensive grid, systems far beyond what had been deployed during previous confrontations. Underground sensors tracked the assault team's movement with millimeter precision, while specialized countermeasures prepared to activate in carefully timed sequence. "They're using thermal masking," Max noted, studying the sensor data, "and counter-surveillance equipment designed to defeat standard security systems." "Expected," Ellie replied calmly. "Activate countermeasure Protocol Delta." Protocol Delta represented technology beyond conventional security systems, specialized sensors that detected the distinctive electromagnetic signatures of active counter-surveillance equipment itself. Rather than trying to penetrate their thermal masking, Ellie's system simply identified the energy emissions from their advanced gear. The approaching force moved with exceptional discipline, maintaining strict communications protocols and employing cover techniques that would have rendered them nearly invisible to standard security. They avoided obvious paths, bypassed conventional trigger points, and utilized specialized equipment to identify potential traps. "They've studied our previous defensive responses," Ellie observed, watching their methodical advance, adapting to avoid triggering similar countermeasures. What they couldn't know was that the previous encounters had been deliberately limited, revealing only a fraction of Blackwood Homestead's true defensive capabilities. The systems now preparing to engage represented Eleanor Reeves' most advanced designs, prototypes never deployed in conventional security applications. As the assault team reached the outer perimeter of the prepared engagement zone, Ellie's fingers moved across the command console with practiced precision. "Initiate tiered response Alpha through Delta." The response began subtly. First, the ground itself seemed to betray the approaching force. Soil composition altered through chemical additives activated by pressure, creating progressively difficult terrain that slowed movement without obvious cause. Then, atmospheric conditions shifted as imperceptible aerosol countermeasures affected equipment performance, degrading sophisticated electronic systems through molecular-level interference. The assault team hesitated, suddenly experiencing equipment failures and environmental resistance without apparent source. Their formation tightened instinctively, moving toward what appeared to be more stable terrain, exactly as Ellie had anticipated. "They've entered the primary containment zone," Max reported, the excitement in his voice barely contained. "Execute containment protocol," Ellie commanded. What followed demonstrated why Eleanor Reeves had been considered the preeminent defensive systems engineer of her generation. The containment zone, a seemingly ordinary clearing approaching the main spring axis, transformed in synchronized sequence. Focused electromagnetic pulses disabled communications equipment, while specialized sonic deterrents operating at frequencies beyond human hearing created disorientation among the assault team. Most dramatically, the clearing's perimeter activated, a containment system unlike anything conventional security could produce, a rapidly deploying barrier combining physical and sensory elements that effectively isolated the assault team from both retreat and advance. Through surveillance monitors, Ellie watched as Blackburn, identifiable by his command position and distinctive tactical gear, realized the trap too late. His team was completely contained within a defensive system specifically designed to neutralize their particular capabilities. Southern, team secured, she confirmed through the command channel. Primary objective defended, but tactical victory at Blackwood Homestead didn't mean the broader conflict was resolved. Reports continued flowing from throughout the valley as additional mercenary elements engaged different targets with varying success. The Henderson timber operation repelled an attempted incursion through judicious use of modified logging equipment transformed into defensive barriers. The Cooper Farm's sophisticated EMP defenses once again disabled vehicle electronics, stranding an assault team half a mile from their intended target. Not all engagements proceeded smoothly. At the Eastern Reservoir, mercenaries with specialized underwater equipment managed to breach initial defenses before being contained by secondary measures. The Church Community Center, serving as an emergency coordination hub, briefly lost communications when signal jamming equipment penetrated their defensive perimeter. Throughout these scattered engagements, Ellie coordinated the valley-wide response with the calm precision of a battlefield commander, allocating resources, adapting defensive protocols, and maintaining the strategic coherence of their overall plan. The integrated communication network Max had created proved invaluable, providing real-time intelligence exchange that allowed rapid adjustment to emerging threats. At 3:17 a.m., a significant development emerged from Blackburn's contained assault team. A figure separated from the group, approaching the barrier with hands raised in the universal gesture of non-aggression. Blackburn's requesting communication, Max reported, zooming surveillance cameras on the mercenary commander. Ellie considered the request carefully. Engaging with Blackburn presented both opportunity and risk, intelligence gathering balanced against potential manipulation. After brief consultation with Agent Kruger, she activated a one-way communication link. "This is Eleanor Blackwood," she stated, her voice projected through speakers at the containment perimeter. "You're trespassing on private property and have been documented committing multiple federal offenses." Blackburn, a lean, weathered man with the unmistakable bearing of special operations background, looked directly at the nearest camera. "Impressive. Set up, Mrs. Blackwood. Or should I say, Lieutenant Commander Reeves. Your reputation in defensive systems design was apparently well earned." His knowledge of her military identity confirmed Ellie's assessment of Archer Global's intelligence capabilities. They had eventually recognized who they were facing, but too late to adjust their operational approach accordingly. "Federal authorities will arrive within hours," she informed him, ignoring the personal reference. "Your employees face serious charges including conspiracy, illegal use of military equipment on domestic soil, and attempted sabotage of critical infrastructure." Blackburn smiled thinly. "A temporary inconvenience. Archer Global operates in 37 countries, Mrs. Blackwood. Legal entanglements are merely operational expenses." "Not this time," Ellie replied with certainty. "Complete documentation of your activities, communications with Westland, and connection to foreign interests has been secured and distributed to multiple federal agencies. This operation has compromised Archer's entire North American division, For the first time, uncertainty flickered across Blackburn's composed features. The implication that their broader corporate structure might be exposed clearly exceeded his anticipated worst-case scenario. "You've won this engagement," he acknowledged after a measured pause, "but resources of this value don't simply disappear from consideration. Others will come. Others will face the same reception," Ellie stated firmly. "Redwood Valley is no longer an isolated rural community. It's a unified defensive entity with federal cooperation and comprehensive security infrastructure." As dawn approached, bringing the promised federal tactical response teams ever closer, the remaining mercenary elements began strategic withdrawal from throughout the valley. Equipment was abandoned, vehicles disabled, and personnel scattered into the surrounding wilderness, many to be apprehended by state police units establishing perimeter containment. At Blackwood Homestead, Ellie maintained the containment field around Blackburn and his primary assault team, ensuring their secure detention until proper federal custody could be established. The major assault had been repelled completely, with minimal property damage and no serious injuries among the defenders. As the first light broke over the eastern ridge, casting long shadows across the valley, Eleanor Blackwood allowed herself a moment of quiet satisfaction. The defensive system she and Daniel had created, enhanced by community cooperation and adapted to valley-wide implementation, had withstood their greatest challenge. The battle for Redwood Valley had reached its decisive engagement. Against overwhelming odds, a community united in defense of their homes had prevailed over forces that should have easily overwhelmed them. And at the center of that victory stood a widow whose hidden talents had transformed vulnerability into unassailable strength. Dawn broke over Redwood Valley with golden light spilling across a landscape transformed not just by the night's conflict, but by the community's unified response to it. Federal agents moved efficiently through Blackwood Homestead, processing detained mercenaries and documenting evidence for what would become one of the largest private security contractor prosecution cases in recent history. Ellie stood on her porch, nursing a cup of coffee while watching the activity with a mixture of relief and weariness. The adrenaline that had sustained her through the night was fading, leaving the bone-deep fatigue familiar from her military days after extended operations. "Remarkable achievement," Agent Kruger commented, joining her with her own steaming mug. 32 mercenaries detained, 17 vehicles seized, and enough evidence to potentially dismantle Archer Global's North American operations. "And the valley?" Ellie asked, her primary concern remaining with the community rather than the broader implications. "Minimal property damage, no serious injuries among defenders. The water infrastructure remains completely secure." Kruger's professional demeanor softened slightly. "You should be proud, Mrs. Blackwood. What you accomplished here isn't just a tactical victory, it's a strategic paradigm shift. Rural communities aren't supposed to successfully resist corporate extraction operations, especially ones with this level of resources." Ellie's gaze drifted to where Robert Cooper and several other local defenders were speaking with federal agents, providing statements about their experiences throughout the night. Their faces showed exhaustion, but also unmistakable pride. "It wasn't my achievement," she replied quietly. "The systems I designed were just tools. The community's willingness to stand together made the difference." Tactical response teams continued processing the containment area where Blackburn and his primary assault unit remained secured. The mercenary commander maintained his professional composure despite his circumstances, occasionally studying Ellie with calculating assessments whenever she came into view. "Director Hayes is flying in personally," Kruger noted, following Ellie's gaze toward the detained operatives. "The mineral deposit situation has been classified as a national security priority. There's already discussion of establishing a federal resource protection zone encompassing the primary deposit areas." This development confirmed Ellie's earlier assessment. Blackburn had been correct about one thing. Resources of this significance didn't simply disappear from consideration. The federal interest would ensure protection from private exploitation, but would bring its own complexities for the local community. The landowners will need guaranteed rights and protections, Ellie stated firmly. Any federal oversight has to preserve their autonomy and ensure environmental safeguards. Kruger nodded in agreement. The initial framework being discussed includes substantial landowner compensation, guaranteed water rights in perpetuity, and strict extraction protocols designed specifically to protect the aquifer system. Their conversation was interrupted by Max Cooper's arrival, the young man's face showing exhaustion but undimmed excitement. Despite having been awake for over 30 hours, his energy remained remarkable. Mrs. Blackwood, the technical assessment team, wants to see you at the command center. They're analyzing our mesh network design and have some questions about the integration protocols. Ellie smiled at his enthusiasm. I think they should be talking to you, Max. It's your system architecture that made the valley-wide defense possible. Max shook his head, a hint of embarrassment coloring his features. I just adapted your basic framework. But listen, he lowered his voice conspiratorially. One of the federal tech specialists mentioned a potential internship opportunity with their cybersecurity division. Said my network design showed exceptional innovative thinking for someone without formal training. That doesn't surprise me at all, Ellie replied warmly. Your talents deserve recognition. As they walked toward the barn, the full extent of the federal response became evident. Helicopters ferried personnel and equipment, mobile command units, established secure communications, and forensic teams meticulously documented every aspect of the night's events. What had begun as a simple property defense had escalated into a federal operation of surprising scale. Inside the command center, Ellie found a mixture of FBI technical specialists and military personnel examining her defensive systems with professional appreciation. Their questions revealed both admiration for her designs and curiosity about systems that in many cases exceeded current government implementations. Some of these approaches aren't in any existing security framework, commented a senior technical advisor, studying the ASU deployment protocols. The reactive environmental adaptation particularly. I've never seen anything comparable outside theoretical proposals. Necessity drives innovation, Ellie replied simply, unwilling to elaborate on classified aspects of her former work that had informed these designs. As the technical debriefing continued, Sheriff Thompson arrived with news from throughout the county. Last of the mercenary stragglers apprehended near the state highway, he reported, and the media presence has tripled since sunrise. National outlets are picking up the story. Rural community repels, corporate mercenaries, is trending across multiple platforms. This development created both opportunity and concern. Public attention would complicate Archer Global's ability to maneuver legally, but also potentially expose sensitive aspects of both Ellie's background and the defensive systems now deployed throughout the valley. Controlled disclosure is essential, Agent Harrington noted, joining the conversation. We're establishing a coordinated media response, emphasizing community cooperation and downplaying the more advanced technical elements. By mid-morning, the situation had stabilized enough for community leaders to gather at Blackwood Homestead for a comprehensive briefing. 24 property owners assembled in Ellie's living room, which had been expanded to accommodate the meeting by opening sliding walls. Another of Daniel's design innovations, originally created for community gatherings. FBI Assistant Director Hayes, newly arrived from Washington, addressed the group with remarkable candor for a senior federal official. Tall and silver-haired, with the measured delivery of someone accustomed to navigating political complexities, he outlined the situation's broader implications. "What you've accomplished here is unprecedented," he began, looking around the room with genuine respect. "A coordinated community defense against professional mercenaries employed by a multinational corporation represents a situation we've never encountered domestically." He explained the federal interest in the mineral deposits, confirming their strategic significance for advanced defense technologies and renewable energy applications. The estimated $9 billion value made them one of the most significant rare earth discoveries in North America, explaining Archer Global's extraordinary efforts to secure access. "Our preliminary proposal involves establishing a federal resource management zone encompassing approximately 30% of the valley," Hayes continued, displaying a map on the large screen. "This would include structured compensation for affected landowners, guaranteed water rights, and strict environmental protocols for any extraction activities." Robert Cooper, acting as informal spokesperson for the local landowners, leaned forward with obvious concern. "And who controls access and operations within this zone? Our community just fought off one outside entity trying to take control of our resources. We're not eager to simply exchange one distant authority for another." Hayes nodded, acknowledging the legitimate concern. "That's precisely why we're proposing a joint management structure. Federal oversight combined with local authority through an elected community board. Extraction would proceed only with dual approval, ensuring both national security interests and local priorities are respected." The discussion continued for over an hour, delving into technical details, legal frameworks, and implementation timelines. Throughout, Ellie noticed a fundamental shift in the dynamics. The federal representatives were approaching the local landowners not as rural citizens needing protection, but as equal partners who had demonstrated remarkable capability and determination. As the meeting concluded, Director Hayes approached Ellie privately. "Lieutenant Commander Reeves," he began, using her former military title. "Your file remains quite active in certain circles, despite your official retirement." Ellie maintained a neutral expression. "I left that life behind when I married Daniel, so I understand. However, your work here, particularly the adaptive defensive systems and community integration protocols, represents innovations with significant national security applications." He handed her a sealed envelope. "When things settle, we'd welcome a consultation role. Your expertise shouldn't be limited to one valley, especially given current global security challenges." Before she could respond, commotion outside drew their attention. Through the window, Ellie saw Blackburn being transferred to a secure transport vehicle under heavy guard. The mercenary commander paused momentarily, looking directly toward her house with an unreadable expression before being escorted into the waiting vehicle. "He's facing substantial charges," Hayes noted, following her gaze. "Though, given Archer Global's resources, legal proceedings will likely be lengthy and complex. And Richard Westland, already cooperating extensively." Apparently, he was unaware of the full extent of Archer's planned operation. He expected corporate pressure and legal maneuvering, not armed mercenaries assaulting civilian properties. As federal personnel began departing with detained prisoners and collected evidence, community members gradually returned to their properties, eager to assess conditions and begin recovery from the night's events. The mood was subdued, but resolute. They had faced an extraordinary threat together and emerged not just intact, but fundamentally strengthened. Samuel Henderson approached Ellie as she stood watching the activity from her porch. The timber operator's weathered face showed the night's strain, but his eyes held new respect. "Never thought I'd see the day when this valley stood as one," he remarked, gazing across the landscape where neighbors were helping neighbors secure properties and restore damaged infrastructure. Been here 40 years. Most folks barely spoke to each other before this. Crisis reveals character, Ellie replied, both individual and collective. Henderson nodded thoughtfully. Cooper told me about your background. The engineering work, the military service, must have been quite something, living with that knowledge and expertise while we all just saw Daniel's widow trying to maintain a homestead. This place was always meant to be more than it appeared, Ellie said, her thoughts turning to Daniel and their shared vision for Blackwood Homestead. Just like the community itself. As the day progressed toward evening, a new rhythm emerged across Redwood Valley. Federal teams maintained presence at key locations, but operational control gradually returned to local authorities. Sheriff Thompson coordinated with state police to establish normalized security protocols, while property owners implemented permanent versions of the temporary defensive measures deployed during the crisis. The strategic victory extended beyond the immediate. Conflict resolution. Through unified action, Redwood Valley had transformed from isolated individuals into a coordinated community with recognized legal standing in determining their resources' future. What Archer Global had attempted to secure through force would now be managed through a cooperative framework that respected both national interests and local autonomy. At Blackwood Homestead, Ellie finally allowed herself proper rest. The accumulated exhaustion of days of planning and night-long tactical coordination catching up at last. As she drifted toward sleep, her thoughts turned to Daniel and what he would have thought of how their defensive systems had performed, not just protecting their property, but securing an entire community's future. The widow's barn remained intact, its sophisticated systems now recognized and valued not as threats, but as assets, and Eleanor Blackwood's hidden expertise, once concealed behind grief and rural simplicity, had become a foundation for an unprecedented partnership between a rural community and federal authorities. The battle was won. The transformation was just beginning. 6 months after the night that transformed Redwood Valley, Ellie stood on the observation platform overlooking what locals now called the Partnership Zone. The viewing area, constructed on a hillside adjacent to her property, provided a perfect vantage point for witnessing an unprecedented collaboration between federal authorities and a rural community. Below, specialized extraction equipment operated, with remarkable precision, accessing the valuable mineral deposits through carefully designed channels that preserved the aquifer system's integrity. Engineers in both federal uniforms and local work clothes moved among the operations, the distinction between government specialist and community representative increasingly blurred through months of close cooperation. Remarkable progress, noted Colonel Jason Mitchell, who had traveled from Washington to conduct a scheduled security review. Extraction yields exceeding projections by 17%, 0 environmental incidents, and full community integration maintained throughout. The Pentagon is calling this the model for all future strategic resource development programs. Ellie nodded, watching as a team led by Max Cooper installed upgraded sensor packages along the extraction zone perimeter. The young man's talents had flourished with formal training, his internship with the Federal Cybersecurity Division transforming into a specialized consultancy role that allowed him to remain in Redwood Valley while implementing cutting-edge monitoring systems. The technical success was always possible, she replied. The governance model is what makes this truly innovative. That model, formerly titled the Redwood Valley Resource Cooperative, had rewritten assumptions about how critical mineral extraction could proceed on private land. Rather than traditional eminent domain approaches or corporate licensing, The framework established joint decision-making authority between federal agencies and the community council elected by local landowners. The President mentioned your contribution specifically during yesterday's security briefing, Mitchell commented. There's still interest in bringing you back in an official capacity, Ellie. The adaptive defensive systems you developed here have applications well beyond this valley. She smiled slightly but shook her head. My place is here, Jason, though I'm happy to consult on specific projects as needed. Their conversation was interrupted by Robert Cooper's arrival. The farmer had emerged as the natural leader of the community council, his practical wisdom and straightforward communication style bridging gaps between bureaucratic processes and local priorities. Quarterly revenue distribution is finalized, he announced, handing Ellie a tablet displaying the financial report. First comprehensive profit-sharing implementation since operations began. This represented another revolutionary aspect of the partnership zone. Unlike traditional resource extraction, where profits flowed primarily to corporate entities or government coffers, the Redwood framework established direct revenue distribution to affected landowners proportional to both property, impact and community contribution. The model ensured that mineral wealth directly benefited those whose land contained it, while maintaining operational viability and national security priorities. Environmental monitoring confirms all parameters within established guidelines. Robert continued, his previous skepticism of government involvement having evolved into pragmatic collaboration. Groundwater quality actually improved in the eastern quadrant due to the filtration systems installed last month. As they discussed operational details, Sheriff Thompson's vehicle approached along the access road. His department had expanded significantly, now including specialized divisions focused on resource security and environmental compliance. The integration of local law enforcement with federal security protocols had created a hybrid approach that maintained community authority while accessing national resources. Thought you'd want to see this immediately, Thompson said as he joined them, handing Mitchell a sealed envelope with federal security markings. Just arrived through secure channels. Mitchell reviewed the contents, his expression shifting to one of satisfied confirmation. The Archer global prosecution is complete. Primary executives sentenced to federal terms for conspiracy, illegal use of military equipment, and attempted resource theft. Adrian Blackburn accepted a plea agreement in exchange for comprehensive testimony about their global operations. And Richard Westland? Ellie asked, knowing that the initial developer had cooperated extensively with authorities. Reduced sentence with supervised release after serving 2 years, Mitchell replied. His testimony proved crucial in establishing the connection between Archer Global and their foreign funding sources. This news represented the final resolution of the direct threat that had initially brought them together. While federal security remained a permanent feature at the extraction zone, the possibility of corporate interference had effectively been eliminated through both legal consequences and the now formalized protection framework. There's more, Thompson added. State legislature unanimously approved the Redwood Valley Security Initiative. Starting next month, our integrated defense approach can be implemented in any county that adopts the regulatory framework. This development particularly satisfied Ellie. The defensive systems originally created to protect Blackwood Homestead had evolved into a community-wide security approach that could now be replicated throughout the state. Rather than militarizing rural areas, the framework emphasized adaptive defense, community coordination, and proportional response, principles derived directly from Ellie's military engineering expertise, but adapted for civilian application. As Mitchell departed for his scheduled security briefing at the extraction facility, Ellie and Robert walked along the ridge path that connected the observation platform to Blackwood Homestead. The trail, now part of an expanded community access network, symbolized the integration of her once isolated property into the broader valley infrastructure. "Sometimes I still can't believe how everything changed," Robert remarked, gazing across the landscape where new construction blended harmoniously with traditional agricultural operations. "A year ago, we were just scattered farms and ranches, each struggling independently. Now we're being studied as a model for community development nationwide." "Crisis often catalyzes latent potential," Ellie replied. "The capability was always here. It just needed circumstances that revealed it." At a junction in the path, Robert continued toward the community center while Ellie turned toward her homestead. The barn, the structure that had initially been targeted by the Rawlins gang, had been expanded, its exterior maintaining traditional appearance, while its interior housed significantly enhanced command and control systems for the valley-wide security network. Inside, she found a small group awaiting her arrival. Samuel Henderson, whose timber operation now included sustainable harvesting contracts with the federal program. Martha Wilkins, whose organic farm had become a testing ground for soil remediation techniques developed alongside extraction operations. And Max Cooper, now officially the Redwood Valley Technical Security Coordinator, despite being only 20 years old. "Quarterly security review complete," Max reported, displaying comprehensive analytics on the main screen. "Perimeter integrity maintained at 99.7% effectiveness, intrusion detection system performing within optimal parameters, and communication network redundancy exceeding federal standards." "The Henderson sector upgrades are complete," Samuel added. "Those new electromagnetic perimeter sensors you designed are remarkable. Can detect approach vectors through weather conditions that would blind conventional systems." Ellie accepted their reports with quiet satisfaction, recognizing how completely the community had embraced the integrated security approach that had once been solely her private domain. What began as personal protection had evolved into collective resilience, a transformation more meaningful than any technical achievement. A soft chime from her communication system announced an incoming secure message. The screen displayed notification of a pending visit from a Department of Energy team interested in adapting the Redwood Valley energy grid integration for implementation at other critical resource sites nationwide. Another example of how their localized solutions were influencing national approaches to increasingly complex resource challenges. As evening approached, Ellie walked alone to the memorial garden she had created behind her house, a quiet space dedicated to Daniel's memory. The stone bench overlooking the valley provided perfect views of both the natural landscape and the thoughtfully integrated extraction operations now providing sustainable prosperity to the community. "You would have loved seeing this," she said softly, her hand resting on the smooth granite marker bearing his name. "Everything we designed together became something far beyond what we imagined. The security systems originally created to protect, their home had evolved into protection for an entire community. The engineering principles developed for military applications had been transformed into frameworks for civilian cooperation. Most importantly, the isolation that had characterized her years of grief had given way to meaningful connection with neighbors who had become partners in an unprecedented enterprise. As darkness settled over Redwood Valley, lights illuminated the extraction zone where evening operations continued under careful supervision. The partnership zone didn't shut down. Its work proceeded around the clock, balancing resource extraction with environmental protection through constant monitoring and adaptive management. Similar lights glowed from neighboring properties, each now protected by security systems derived from Ellie's designs, but adapted to their specific needs and capabilities. Ellie's satellite phone chimed with a scheduled check-in from the night shift security coordinator. "All systems normal, Mrs. Blackwood," came the professional report. "Perimeter integrity confirmed, surveillance network fully operational, peaceful evening across all sectors." "Thank you, Jenkins." "Maintain standard protocols," she replied, completing the routine exchange that represented not just operational security, but community continuity. Standing in her garden, Eleanor Blackwood reflected on the journey from military engineer to grieving widow to community security architect. The path had been neither direct nor easy, but had ultimately led to a legacy far more meaningful than any single achievement from her former career. The attempted burning of a widow's barn had revealed hidden capabilities not just in her defensive systems, but in the community's capacity for unified action. What began as protection of personal property had evolved into protection of shared values, resources, and future prosperity. Tomorrow would bring federal officials seeking her expertise, community members implementing her designs, and ongoing operations, extracting valuable minerals from beneath the land she called home. But tonight, under stars that had witnessed both her private grief and public triumph, Eleanor Blackwood simply appreciated the peace secured through preparation, innovation, and the unexpected strength found in community bonds. The widow, with hidden traps, had become the architect of a new model for resource communities nationwide. And the barn that enemies had once targeted for destruction now stood as the command center for a security approach studied by governments around the world. Some transformations could never have been predicted, but in retrospect seemed almost inevitable. Just like the strength that emerges when capability meets opportunity and individual resilience combines with collective purpose. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.